What if the person who knew what happened to your child walked past you every single day, served you coffee, smiled, made small talk, while you plastered missing posters on every lamppost, while you called the police for the 1,000th time, while you couldn't sleep because the not knowing was eating you alive? They were right there. In 1979, a 6-year-old disappeared 2 blocks from home in broad daylight. The answer was hiding behind a bodega counter for 33 years. May 25th, 1979. Memorial Day weekend was coming. The Yankees were in California playing the Angels. Studio 54 was still the hottest club in Manhattan. And in a Soho loft on Prince Street, 6-year-old Etan Patz couldn't sleep. Tomorrow, Friday, would be his first time walking to the school bus alone. He'd been begging his parents for weeks. 2 blocks. Just 2 blocks. He was ready to be a big kid. His mother, Julie, had walked that route with him dozens of times. Past the bodega on the corner, past the fire station, straight to the bus stop. They'd practiced. She'd taught him about strangers, about staying on the sidewalk, about not talking to anyone. Everything a good 1970s parent was supposed to do. And Friday morning, she stood on the fire escape and watched her little boy, wearing his favorite blue Eastern Airlines captain bag so proud, disappear around the corner. That image would burn into her brain for the next 38 years. Every detail, the way he walked, how he didn't look back, the moment he vanished from her sight. By 3:30 that afternoon, Julie Patz was on the phone with the NYPD, and by evening, their neighborhood looked like a war zone. Police cruisers everywhere, officers knocking on every door, search dogs picking up Etan's scent and losing it within a block. A 6-year-old kid had evaporated in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. No witnesses, no screams, no blood, nothing. Just gone. The case that followed would change everything. How we investigate missing children, how we think about child safety, how an entire generation of American parents would raise their kids. Etan's face would appear on milk cartons across the country, his story would inspire federal legislation, and his name would become synonymous with every parent's worst nightmare. But for 33 years, nobody knew the truth. The person responsible was living less than an hour away, carrying a secret that would eventually tear him apart from the inside. This is that story. Friday, May 25th, 1979. Temperature was climbing into the 70s. Perfect spring morning in New York City. The kind of day where kids would be thinking about summer vacation, about getting out of school, about freedom. Etan Patz woke up early, too excited to sleep in. He'd laid out his clothes the night before. Blue pants, blue sneakers, that Eastern Airlines bag his father had gotten him. Stanley Patz was a photographer, one of the good ones, working in Soho back when it was still industrial lofts and artist spaces, before it became the boutique shopping district it is today. The Patzes were part of that creative community, raising their kids in a neighborhood that still had edge to it, but felt like home. That morning, Julie watched from the fire escape as Etan headed out around 8 a.m. She could see him for maybe half a block before he turned the corner onto West Broadway. Gone. She went back inside, got his younger siblings ready, started her day. You don't know when ordinary moments become the last moments. You don't know when letting your kid have a little independence becomes the decision that destroys your entire life. By lunchtime, she figured maybe he'd stayed after school, maybe gone to a friend's house. But that feeling, mothers know this feeling, that cold dread that starts in your chest and spreads like ice water through your veins, it was already there. When the school called asking why Etan hadn't shown up, everything collapsed. Julie was on the phone with police by 3:30 p.m., and the response was immediate. This wasn't some runaway teenager, some domestic dispute. This was a 6-year-old kid who'd vanished between his front door and a bus stop 2 blocks away. Within hours, over 100 NYPD officers flooded Soho. They brought in bloodhounds, German shepherds that picked up Etan's scent on the sidewalk and followed it maybe a block before losing it completely. That detail told investigators everything they needed to know. Etan had gotten into a vehicle. Someone had taken him. The first 24 hours of a missing child case are absolutely critical. And in 1979, the protocols we have now didn't exist. No Amber Alert, no coordinated federal response system, no instant mass communication. The Patzes were navigating a nightmare with no roadmap, working with detectives who were dedicated but operating in an era before DNA databases, before criminal profiling was standard, before we understood predatory behavior the way we do now. They were searching for their son in a city of 8 million people with technology that seems almost primitive by today's standards. That first night, Julian Stanley's loft filled with police, with neighbors, with reporters who'd already picked up the story. A photogenic 6-year-old vanishing in Manhattan was news, the kind that spreads fast. Television crews set up on Prince Street. The story led the evening broadcasts. And somewhere in that neighborhood, someone knew exactly what had happened to Etan Patz. Someone was going about their evening like nothing had happened, while a family's entire world was burning down. The search for Etan Patz became something New York City had never experienced before. Prince Street turned into a command center. Police vehicles parked bumper to bumper, officers coordinating search grids, volunteers showing up with coffee and sandwiches, everyone wanting to help. The NYPD went door to door through hundreds of buildings in Soho and surrounding neighborhoods. They questioned every shopkeeper, every street vendor, every person who might have been on Prince Street that Friday morning. The problem was, this was New York in 1979. People minded their own business. A man talking to a kid on the sidewalk? That happened 100 times a day. Nobody noticed. Nobody remembered. Stanley Patz's photography background became both a blessing and a curse. He had recent, high-quality photos of Etan, professional shots that showed every detail of his son's face. Those images got distributed immediately to every precinct in the city, to every news outlet, plastered on walls and telephone poles throughout Manhattan. But having those perfect photos also meant Stanley had to look at his son's face everywhere he went. On missing posters, on the evening news, in newspapers. The same face he'd photographed smiling and laughing, now staring out from flyers asking if anyone had seen him. Community volunteers organized search parties that went through every basement, every rooftop, every abandoned building in Soho. They checked dumpsters, crawled through construction sites, searched anywhere a child could be hidden or might have wandered. For weeks, people showed up at the Patz's door offering to help, bringing food, sharing tips, most of which led nowhere but showed something beautiful about humanity even in darkness. The neighborhood rallied in ways that seem almost quaint now, but back then, before social media could mobilize thousands instantly, this grassroots response was revolutionary. But the investigation kept hitting walls. The NYPD was working with paper files, telephone calls, physical legwork. When they ran background checks on potential suspects, they were searching incomplete databases that didn't communicate across jurisdictions. A predator with a record in Connecticut or New Jersey might not show up in a New York search unless someone specifically requested those files. The FBI got involved, relatively rare for a local missing persons case, but even their resources were limited. They conducted hundreds of interviews, followed up on thousands of tips from people who swore they'd seen Etan. California, Florida, Canada. Every sighting had to be checked, and everyone turned out to be another kid who just looked similar. As spring turned to summer, the active search started winding down, not because anyone gave up, but because you can't maintain that level of resource deployment indefinitely. The case remained open, detectives continued working leads, but the army of volunteers gradually dispersed. The news crews moved on to other stories, and the Patz family was left in this terrible limbo, not knowing if their son was alive somewhere, not knowing if they should keep hoping or start grieving. They made a decision that would define the next 4 decades. They refused to move. Same apartment, same phone number, same everything. Because if Etan was out there, if he somehow found his way back, he'd know where home was. The Etan Patz case hit America like a gut punch. This wasn't the first child to go missing, not even close. But something about this particular case captured the national consciousness in a way that forced uncomfortable conversations. Maybe it was Etan's face, those photos Stanley had taken showing a kid who could have been anyone's son. Maybe it was the Manhattan setting, the fact that this happened in broad daylight in one of the busiest cities on Earth. Maybe it was just timing. 1979 was already a paranoid time in America. The Iran hostage crisis was unfolding, crime rates were spiking. The Son of Sam killings were still fresh in New York's memory. People were primed to believe the world was getting more dangerous. What happened next became iconic, something everyone over 40 remembers. Missing children on milk cartons. The National Child Safety Council launched this campaign in the early 80s. And while Etan wasn't the first child featured, he became the face of the movement. Picture this. You're pouring milk into your coffee every morning, and there's a missing kid staring back at you. Name, age, last seen, a face frozen in time. Millions of Americans saw these images daily, and the psychology was brilliant. If enough people see these faces during mundane routines, maybe someone recognizes a child, maybe one tip cracks a case. For the Patz family, seeing Etan's photo distributed nationwide gave them hope that someone, somewhere, knew something. But the case also triggered a massive shift in American parenting culture, one we're still living with today. Before Etan, kids walking to school alone, playing unsupervised in neighborhoods, riding bikes until dark. That was normal childhood. That was how you grew up. After Etan, that independence started evaporating. Parents became hypervigilant. The phrase stranger danger entered the vocabulary. Organized playdates replaced spontaneous outdoor play. Schools implemented strict pickup policies. An entire generation of kids grew up with less freedom than their parents had, and you can trace that shift directly back to cases like this one. Law enforcement started recognizing they needed better systems. The FBI began developing behavioral profiles specifically for child predators, studying patterns that could help identify suspects before they struck. Police departments across the country implemented new protocols for missing children, understanding that the first hours require massive resource deployment, not the wait-and-see approach that had been standard. Training programs emerged teaching officers how to interview child witnesses, how to preserve evidence in abduction cases, how to coordinate with media effectively. The Missing Children's Act passed Congress in 1982, requiring the FBI to assist local police and mandating entry of missing children's info into national databases. All these changes, all this awareness, all this national awakening. And Etan was still gone. His parents watched their tragedy become a symbol, watched their son's face become synonymous with missing children everywhere, and they still had no answers. They attended conferences where experts discussed child safety protocols. They met other families going through similar nightmares. They supported legislation, gave interviews, kept Etan's story alive. But every night they went back to that Soho loft where their son's room sat empty, unchanged, waiting. That kind of sustained grief, that public mourning without closure, it's a special form of torture. You can't fully grieve without a body, but you can't fully hope after years pass. You just exist in between forever. Jose Antonio Ramos entered the investigation a few years after Etan disappeared, and everything about him screamed predator. This wasn't some random name pulled from a list. Ramos had a direct connection to the Patz family that made investigators' blood run cold. He'd been dating a woman who worked as a babysitter for Etan, which meant Ramos had been inside the Patz home, had interacted with Etan, had access that most strangers wouldn't have. When detectives started digging into his background, they found exactly what they feared: a conviction for child molestation in Pennsylvania, a history of targeting young boys around Etan's age. The circumstantial evidence was disturbing enough to make Ramos the prime suspect for over 3 decades. During prison interviews, he'd make these cryptic statements about a boy he called Ramos, yes, referring to the child by his own name, which was already bizarre. Talking about taking this boy to a drainpipe, details that seemed too specific to be coincidental. He never confessed outright, never said, "I took Etan Patz," but he never fully denied it either. He played psychological games with investigators, the kind of manipulation that convicted predators excel at, giving just enough information to seem significant while maintaining plausible deniability. The FBI brought in behavioral analysts from Quantico, and their profile fit Ramos perfectly. He matched the age range, had the criminal history, had the opportunity and connection. For the Patz family, Ramos became the personification of their nightmare. This was the face of evil, the man who destroyed their lives. In 2001, Stanley Patz sued Ramos in civil court, seeking a wrongful death judgment. Civil court operates on a different standard than criminal court, preponderance of evidence rather than beyond reasonable doubt. The judge ruled in the Patz family's favor, awarding them $2 million in damages and legally declaring Etan deceased after 22 years of limbo. But here's the brutal reality of the American justice system. Civil judgments aren't criminal convictions. You can win $2 million in civil court and still not have enough evidence for a criminal trial. Prosecutors in Manhattan wanted desperately to charge Ramos with murder, spent years trying to build a case that would stick. But every angle hit the same wall. No physical evidence connecting him to Etan's disappearance. No body, no DNA, no witnesses, no confession that would hold up in criminal court. They had a convicted child molester with means, motive, and opportunity. But in America, suspicion isn't enough for a murder conviction. Ramos served his full sentence on the molestation charges and walked out of prison in November 2012. Can you imagine what that felt like for the Patz family? The man they believed killed their son, the man a civil court judge had ruled responsible for their son's death, walking free, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The Manhattan DA's office was furious. Victims' advocates were outraged, but without that one piece of physical evidence, without that smoking gun, Ramos couldn't be touched. For decades, everyone assumed the case was essentially solved, that Ramos was guilty, and it was just a matter of time before someone proved it. Turns out, everyone was wrong. Living in limbo, true limbo, not the temporary uncertainty most people experience, changes you at a cellular level. The Patz family existed in that space for 33 years before getting any real answers. And I've talked to enough families of missing persons to know this is a unique form of suffering. Every birthday that passed, they'd calculate how old Etan would be. 7, then 10, then 16, then graduating high school, then old enough to have his own kids. They lived in two realities simultaneously, the one where Etan was probably dead, and the one where maybe, somehow, miraculously, he was still alive somewhere. That Soho loft became both shrine and prison. Etan's room stayed exactly as he'd left it on May 25, 1979. Toys on the shelves, clothes in the closet, bed made. Friends and family urged them to move, to start over somewhere without constant reminders. But they couldn't. What if Etan came home and they weren't there? What if someone with information drove by looking for them? These might sound irrational, but rationality is a luxury when you're living in trauma for 3 decades. The apartment became a beacon, a lighthouse signal broadcasting. We're still here, we're still waiting, come home. Stanley channeled his grief into activism, becoming one of the most prominent voices in the missing children movement. He testified before Congress, pushed for legislation, worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There's something both heroic and heartbreaking about this, transforming your worst experience into a mission to prevent other families from suffering the same fate. Stanley helped create infrastructure that legitimately saved lives, helped find children who might otherwise have remained missing. But none of that activism brought Etan home, and you have to imagine there were dark moments when all that purpose felt hollow. The media revisited the case on milestone anniversaries. 10 years, 20 years, 25 years since Etan vanished. Each time reporters showed up asking Julie and Stanley to relive the worst day of their lives for a 5-minute segment, to describe their pain for viewers who'd watch, feel sad for a moment, then move on. But the Patz family participated because they understood that sustained attention was their best weapon. Sometimes it worked. Tips would come in, investigators would follow up, the case would briefly reignite. Then the trail would go cold again, and they'd return to waiting. The case became almost mythological in true crime circles. Internet forums debated theories. Podcast hosts dissected every detail. Armchair detectives argued about suspects and scenarios. Some of this attention kept the case alive in public consciousness, which was valuable. But some of it was exploitative, treating real tragedy like a puzzle to solve, entertainment to consume. The Patz family had to watch their son's disappearance become content, become a mystery for people to debate over coffee. And through it all, through the activism, the media attention, the theories, the dead ends, they maintained this impossible dignity. They never stopped cooperating with police, never stopped believing that somehow, someday, truth would surface. They just didn't know it would take 33 years and come from a phone call completely out of the blue. April 2012. 33 years after Etan vanished, NYPD officers and FBI agents descended on a Soho basement with jackhammers, excavation equipment, and cadaver dogs. The media went absolutely insane. News helicopters circled overhead. Reporters set up camp on the street. The building in question, 127 Prince Street, had been searched back in 1979, but investigators had received new information suggesting they needed to look deeper. Literally. The property had been used as a workshop by a handyman named Othniel Miller, and new tips indicated he might have been involved in Etan's disappearance. The excavation was massive, methodical, expensive, the kind of operation you only launch when you're confident you'll find something. They didn't just pull up floorboards, they brought in ground-penetrating radar, forensic anthropologists, evidence techs treating the site like an archaeological dig. Every layer of concrete and soil might contain evidence, so they documented everything, sifted through tons of debris. The neighborhood transformed back into the crime scene it had been in 1979. Police tape, media trucks, gawkers with cameras. And through it all, the Patz family waited, watching coverage, not going to the site, but obviously emotionally invested in every shovelful of dirt removed. This new lead challenged everything investigators thought they knew. For decades, Ramos had been the guy, the prime suspect, the man everyone assumed had taken Etan. Now they were looking at a completely different scenario, that Etan might have been killed and buried within blocks of his home, that his body had been there the entire time while police searched nationwide, while his face appeared on milk cartons, while America mobilized to find him. Othniel Miller had been a peripheral figure in the original investigation, briefly interviewed but never seriously considered. Now investigators were asking themselves if they'd missed something crucial 3 decades earlier, if the answer had been hiding in plain sight. The excavation continued for days. You could feel the tension building with every update, every press conference where officials said they were still searching, still analyzing, still hopeful. Forensic teams worked around the clock, knowing that if they found remains after 33 years, the evidence would need to be pristine for any prosecution. The Patz family stayed away physically, but were there in spirit, probably reliving that terrible hope-dread combination they'd experienced so many times before. After 33 years of not knowing, the possibility of finally recovering Etan's remains, of being able to bury their son properly, must have been overwhelming. Then, nothing. The excavation came up empty. No remains. No physical evidence connecting the site to Etan. No breakthrough. The crews packed up their equipment, filled in the holes, and Soho returned to normal. For the Patz family, this was just another devastating chapter in a book full of them. Another moment where answers seemed within reach only to dissolve like smoke. The media coverage died down. Othniel Miller faded back into obscurity. Everyone assumed the case would return to cold storage, that this had been another dead end in an investigation full of them. But what nobody realized, what nobody could have predicted, was that all that media attention had shaken something loose. Someone watching the coverage made a phone call that would finally, after 33 years, crack this case wide open. Sometimes justice comes from the places you least expect. In May 2012, just weeks after the basement excavation dominated every news cycle, a phone rang at the NYPD Missing Persons Squad. The person on the other end wasn't a psychic, wasn't some random tipster claiming they'd seen Etan at a gas station in Nebraska. This was a family member calling about their own relative, which immediately elevated the credibility. The caller explained that Pedro Hernandez, a man who'd worked at a bodega near the Patz apartment in 1979, had allegedly confessed to killing a boy in Manhattan. Not once, multiple times over the years, to different people. He'd done something bad to a child in New York, he'd told them, something he couldn't take back. The detective who took that call must have felt adrenaline spike through his system. Here was information that checked every box. Means, Hernandez worked along Etan's route, opportunity, he was there that morning, and now apparent confession. He'd told multiple people over decades. But here's where it gets complicated. Hernandez had documented mental health issues, schizophrenia, hallucinations, a history of bizarre behavior, which meant this could be a genuine confession, or it could be someone with psychiatric problems confabulating details from a famous case. Investigators knew they had to tread carefully. A false confession would devastate the Patz family all over again, and potentially let the real killer remain free. When they pulled Hernandez's file, they found exactly nothing. No prior connection to the case, no interview from 1979, no indication anyone had ever looked at him seriously. He'd been a teenage employee at a small convenience store on Prince Street, right along Etan's route. But back in 1979, nobody had systematically investigated every single worker at every business in the area. This was before databases could cross-reference people efficiently, before background checks were routine for this type of investigation. Suspects could slip through the cracks simply because nobody thought to look at them closely. Hernandez had been invisible, hiding in the open for 33 years. The NYPD brought Hernandez in for questioning in May 2012. He wasn't under arrest initially. They needed him to talk voluntarily, needed to evaluate whether this was genuine confession or psychiatric delusion. And what happened next floors me every time I think about it. Hernandez started talking. No lawyer, no refusal to cooperate. He just started describing what happened on May 25th, 1979. in detail that seemed impossible to fake. He told investigators he'd been working at the bodega that morning, had seen this little boy walking alone, and something inside him snapped. An urge he couldn't resist, an impulse he couldn't explain even to himself. According to the confession, Hernandez said he lured Etan into the basement of the store with the promise of a soda. Stop and think about that for a second. A 6-year-old kid, probably nervous about his first solo walk to school, and this teenage clerk offering him something as simple as a cold drink on a warm May morning. It's such a tragically mundane detail, the kind of thing that happens in neighborhoods everywhere, kids interacting with local shopkeepers they see daily. But this interaction ended with Hernandez claiming he strangled Etan in that basement, put his body in a bag, and disposed of it with the garbage. The details were specific. Chilling. And now investigators had to figure out if they were true, or if they were dealing with a mentally ill man who'd convinced himself he'd committed a crime he'd only read about. Pedro Hernandez wasn't what you'd picture when you imagine a child killer. Short, soft-spoken, unremarkable. The kind of guy you'd pass on the street without a second glance. When his name hit the news in 2012, neighbors in Mapleshade, New Jersey expressed genuine shock. Coworkers couldn't believe it. This was someone who seemed harmless, meek even. Definitely not the monster you'd expect. But I've covered enough cases to know that predators don't announce themselves. The scariest people are often the ones who blend seamlessly into normal society, who hold down jobs and have families, and seem completely ordinary while carrying unimaginable secrets. The portrait that emerged during investigation was of a deeply troubled man who'd been wrestling with guilt for over 3 decades. According to testimony from family and acquaintances, Hernandez had made scattered comments over the years about having hurt a child in New York, about something terrible he'd done that haunted him. His brother-in-law testified that at a family gathering, Hernandez had confessed to choking a boy in Manhattan. A member of his prayer group came forward saying Hernandez had asked for prayers regarding something evil he'd committed. These weren't deathbed confessions or drunken slips. These were revelations spread across decades, suggesting whatever happened in 1979 had eaten at him in ways he couldn't escape. Hernandez's psychological profile was complex. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia, had experienced hallucinations and delusions throughout adulthood, which immediately raised flags about confession reliability. Defense attorneys would argue he had a history of false confessions, that he was suggestible and prone to taking blame for things he hadn't done. But prosecutors countered that mental illness doesn't equal incapability of committing murder, that plenty of people with psychiatric conditions commit crimes. The question became, was this genuine confession from someone who'd carried guilt for 33 years? Or was this a mentally ill man confessing to a famous crime he'd heard about his entire adult life? Looking at 1979, Hernandez had been just 18 years old, a recent arrival to New York, spoke limited English, worked that bodega job as his first real employment in the city. He was a loner by all accounts, didn't have many friends, was trying to figure out his life in a new place. That job at the bodega was supposed to be temporary, a stepping stone while he got established. Instead, if his confession was true, he'd committed a crime that would alter American attitudes toward child safety for generations. What drives an 18-year-old to hurt a child he's never met? Hernandez couldn't really explain it, describing it as an impulse, something that came over him that morning that he couldn't control or understand even decades later. One of the most disturbing aspects was realizing Hernandez had been there the whole time. While police searched nationwide, while they investigated Ramos for decades, while the Patz family existed in limbo, Hernandez was living less than an hour away in New Jersey. He'd gotten married, had a daughter of his own, worked regular jobs, watched the media coverage, seen Etan's face on milk cartons, knew that an entire nation was searching for a boy whose body he'd allegedly thrown away like trash. The compartmentalization required to live with that knowledge, to interact with his own child while knowing what he'd done to someone else's, speaks to either profound mental illness, sociopathic detachment, or both. And now, 33 years later, that secret was finally surfacing in ways that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about this case. When Pedro Hernandez sat across from NYPD detectives in May 2012, what poured out was a narrative that had apparently been festering inside him for 33 years. The confession was videotaped, over 7 hours of interrogation that would later be dissected frame by frame, analyzed by psychiatric experts, debated in courtrooms. Hernandez described May 25, 1979 in detail that was either genuine memory or elaborately constructed delusion. He said he'd been working the opening shift at the bodega early morning, maybe around 8 a.m. He saw this little boy walking by himself, unusual enough to catch his attention, and according to Hernandez, something inside him snapped, an overwhelming urge. An impulse he described as coming out of nowhere, something he couldn't resist even though he knew it was wrong. He told investigators he called out to Etan, offered him a soda. Think about the psychology of that moment. A 6-year-old kid, probably already nervous about walking alone, and here's an adult offering him something. The bodega was familiar territory, a place Etan had probably been to with his parents. Accepting would have seemed safe, normal, maybe even polite. According to the confession, Etan followed Hernandez into the store, and that's when everything went dark. The basement where Hernandez claimed the murder happened was cramped, dimly lit, the kind of storage space used for extra inventory. Definitely not somewhere customers went. He described luring Etan down there under pretense of getting that promised drink, and once they were alone, he said he strangled the boy. The way Hernandez described the act itself was almost detached, like recounting something that happened to someone else. Psychologists would debate whether this was dissociation, whether it was rehearsed, whether it was confession from someone who'd lived with this secret so long it had become abstract. He told detectives Etan struggled, that it took a few minutes, that afterwards, the boy was dead in that dark basement while upstairs, regular life continued. People buying newspapers, getting coffee, completely unaware that just below them, a child had been murdered. The mundane horror of that detail, life going on normally, feet away from where a 6-year-old was being killed, is something that shows up in a lot of confessions, but never stops being chilling. What happened next, according to Hernandez, shows both panic and calculation. He said he found a box or bag, accounts vary slightly depending on which version of the confession you read, and stuffed Etan's body inside. He described carrying this bag out through the back of the store, walking to where garbage was collected, and leaving it there with regular trash. Think about the horrible randomness of that. A 6-year-old child reduced to garbage, potentially ending up in a landfill somewhere, which would explain why despite extensive searches involving hundreds of officers and cadaver dogs, Etan's body was never recovered. Hernandez claimed he then went back to work, finished his shift, went home. The ability to return to normal life immediately after committing murder is something that appears in many confessions, but it never stops being deeply unsettling. Detectives pressed him on details only the killer would know: what Etan was wearing, what the basement looked like, timing of events. This is where the confession becomes both more credible and more complicated. Some details Hernandez provided matched what investigators knew. He correctly described the Captain flight bag Etan was carrying, mentioned it was a Friday, got the general time frame right, but other details were vague or inconsistent. He couldn't remember exactly what he'd done with the body after leaving it with trash. Couldn't provide specifics about Etan's clothing beyond what had been widely reported in media for 33 years. Defense attorneys would argue that anyone who'd followed the case could know these publicly available details, that nothing in the confession constituted genuine insider knowledge, proving Hernandez was actually there. But prosecutors saw something different. A man finally unburdening himself of a secret that had been destroying him from the inside, struggling to remember specific details from an event 3 decades past, while clearly remembering the emotional weight of what he'd done. Getting a confession is one thing. Making it stick in court when you have no body, no physical evidence, no witnesses, and a defendant with documented mental illness, that's an entirely different challenge. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office knew they were walking a legal tightrope. This was arguably the most famous cold case in American history. If they botched the prosecution, the Patz family would be devastated again, and Hernandez might walk free despite his confession. In 2012, Hernandez was formally charged with second-degree murder and kidnapping, and the legal machinery that had been dormant for 33 years suddenly roared to life with intensity that surprised even veteran court watchers. The defense strategy was predictable but brutally effective. They hammered Hernandez's mental state relentlessly. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified that Hernandez suffered from a personality disorder, making him prone to false confessions, that he had documented history of taking blame for things he hadn't done, that he was suggestible and desperate for attention or approval. They painted a picture of a mentally ill man who'd become obsessed with the Etan Patz case over decades of media coverage, who'd internalized details and constructed false memories of committing the crime. They showed examples of Hernandez confessing to other things he clearly hadn't done, establishing a pattern of unreliable self-incrimination. Prosecutors built their counter-narrative carefully. They brought witnesses who testified that Hernandez's confessions to family members predated the intense 2012 media coverage, that he'd been telling people about killing a boy in Manhattan for years before anyone suspected him. His brother-in-law took the stand describing that chilling conversation at a family gathering where Hernandez admitted to choking a child. A prayer group member testified about Hernandez seeking forgiveness for something terrible he'd done. These weren't confessions made to police under interrogation pressure. These were admissions made to people he trusted in private moments, long before he became a suspect. The prosecution argued that while Hernandez had mental health issues, that didn't mean he was innocent. Plenty of people with psychiatric conditions commit crimes and remember doing so. The first trial began in October 2015, and it was a media spectacle that rivaled the original 1979 coverage. Courtroom sketch artists, international reporters, true crime enthusiasts camping out for seats. The Patz family attended every single day, sitting through testimony that forced them to imagine their son's final moments over and over again. For weeks, jurors heard competing psychiatric testimony. Defense experts saying Hernandez was too mentally ill for his confession to be reliable, prosecution experts saying his mental illness didn't preclude guilt. They watched the videotaped confession multiple times, seeing Hernandez describe strangling a 6-year-old, his expressions ranging from remorseful to detached to confused. The evidence was entirely circumstantial, which meant this case would come down to whether 12 jurors believed beyond reasonable doubt that Hernandez's confession was truthful. After 18 days of deliberation, an unusually long time suggesting serious disagreement, the jury announced they were hopelessly deadlocked. 11 jurors believed Hernandez was guilty. One holdout believed he was mentally ill and had falsely confessed. The judge declared a mistrial, and just like that, months of emotional testimony, thousands of hours of preparation, and the Patz family's hope for closure evaporated. That single juror's reasonable doubt meant starting over from scratch. For Julie and Stanley Patz, this was crushing in ways that's hard to articulate. They'd endured the trial, heard all the evidence, watched Hernandez describe killing their son, and still had no legal resolution. But Manhattan prosecutors weren't backing down. Assistant District Attorney Joni Luzzi announced they'd retry the case, that they believed in the strength of their evidence despite the setback. The legal community debated whether retrying made sense. Would a second jury see things differently? Or would Hernandez's mental health issues create perpetual, reasonable doubt? The Patz family supported retrying, saying they'd endured 37 years of not knowing and could endure another trial if it meant finally getting justice. So the legal machinery geared up again, both sides refining their strategies based on what had and hadn't worked the first time, preparing for another battle over whether Pedro Hernandez's confession was truth or delusion. The second trial began in October 2016, and prosecutors came in with a refined strategy based on hard lessons from the first trial. They knew that single holdout juror had focused on mental health issues, so they needed to address the psychiatric defense more aggressively while making Hernandez's guilt feel inevitable. They brought additional witnesses who'd heard Hernandez's admissions over the years, building a timeline showing he'd been confessing long before media attention intensified, long before he became a suspect. The prosecution emphasized that Hernandez's descriptions contained emotional authenticity that felt genuine rather than fabricated, that his guilt had been eating at him for decades in ways that psychiatric confabulation couldn't explain. The defense maintained their strategy but amplified it, bringing even more psychiatric experts who testified about Hernandez's vulnerability to suggestion, his documented history of hallucinations, his pattern of taking blame for things beyond his control. They argued that during the 7-hour interrogation, detectives had essentially fed Hernandez details, that a mentally ill person desperate for approval might confess to anything under the right circumstances. They showed jury members examples of other false confessions in famous cases, the Central Park Five, countless others, demonstrating this phenomenon isn't rare, especially among people with psychiatric conditions. The defense team was fighting to prevent Hernandez from spending the rest of his life in prison for something they maintained he didn't do. One of the most powerful moments came when prosecutors played portions of Hernandez's videotaped confession. Watching a man describe strangling a 6-year-old child, even if that man might be mentally ill, creates a visceral reaction that written transcripts can't capture. Hernandez's demeanor on the tape, sometimes remorseful, sometimes detached, sometimes confused, gave jurors a window into his psychological state. You could see him struggling to articulate why he'd done it, describing impulses he didn't understand even decades later. The prosecution argued these were emotions of a guilty man finally unburdening himself. The defense countered that his confusion and inconsistencies proved he was an unreliable narrator of his own supposed crimes. In February 2017, after 9 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all counts, murder in the second degree, and kidnapping in the first degree. The courtroom reaction was immediate and emotional. Stanley Patz later described it as surreal, that after 38 years of not knowing, of suspecting Ramos, of following countless dead ends, they finally had legal confirmation of what happened to Etan. Julie Patz broke down, decades of grief and relief colliding in that moment. The guilty verdict meant Hernandez would face 25 years to life in prison, essentially ensuring he'd die behind bars. For the Patz family, this wasn't complete closure. Etan's body was never recovered, they couldn't bury their son, couldn't visit a grave, but it was the closest thing to justice they'd ever gotten. Assistant District Attorney Jonah Lutzi's statement after the verdict captured something profound about the case's broader significance. She told reporters, "It's a story that inspires caution. It's a landmark, a loss of innocence. Etan will forever symbolize the loss of that innocence." She was right. This case represented a before and after moment in American culture, a dividing line between an era when kids walked to school alone without a second thought, and an era when parents became hyper-vigilant about every potential threat. At sentencing in April 2017, the judge handed down 25 years to life, and Hernandez was led away to begin serving his sentence. Stanley Patz told the court, "The Patz family has waited a long time, but we finally have some measure of justice for Etan." After 38 years, the legal chapter was finally closed. The legacy of Etan Patz extends far beyond his individual tragedy. This case fundamentally rewrote how America protects its children and investigates their disappearances. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25th as National Missing Children's Day, forever linking Etan's disappearance to a nationwide commitment to finding lost kids. This wasn't just symbolic gesture. It represented federal acknowledgement that child abduction required coordinated, systematic responses rather than leaving families to navigate nightmares alone. Every year since, law enforcement agencies, advocacy groups, and families of missing children gather on May 25th to remember, to recommit, to ensure that the lessons learned from Etan's case continue driving policy and protection. The legislative changes that followed were revolutionary in scope. Congress passed the Missing Children's Act in 1982, requiring the FBI to assist local police in investigating child abductions, and mandating entry of missing children is information into the National Crime Information Center database. Before this, and this is stunning to consider, there was no centralized system for tracking missing kids across state lines. A child could vanish in New York, and police in New Jersey wouldn't necessarily have access to that information unless someone made specific phone calls. The Patz case exposed these gaps in ways that made them impossible to ignore, and lawmakers responded with frameworks still in use today, still saving lives. The cultural impact might be even more significant than the legal changes. That milk carton campaign featuring Etan's face became the template for how we disseminate information about missing children, eventually evolving into Amber Alert's digital billboards, social media campaigns, all tools that trace their lineage back to those dairy cartons in the 1980s. Parenting changed fundamentally, in ways we're still processing and debating. The concept of stranger danger became embedded in how we raise children, the idea that the world outside your door is fundamentally unsafe. Some sociologists argue this shift went too far, that we've raised a generation experiencing less independence and risk-taking necessary for healthy development. But you can't separate these overcorrections from the trauma of cases like Etan's. When a 6-year-old can disappear in broad daylight on a 2-block walk, parents naturally become hypervigilant. Law enforcement training programs created entirely new specializations around child abduction cases. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed detailed profiles of child predators, studying patterns and warning signs that could help identify suspects before they strike or catch them faster after they do. Police departments implemented rapid response protocols, recognizing that the first few hours after a child goes missing are absolutely critical. Every minute counts when you're trying to prevent an abduction from becoming a murder. Forensic techniques improved dramatically, with investigators learning to preserve and analyze evidence in ways that weren't possible in 1979. Touch DNA, digital forensics, cell phone tracking, none of these improvements helped Etan, but they've helped countless children since. Stanley Patz's activism deserves special recognition because it demonstrates how personal tragedy can fuel systemic change. He became a prominent voice in the missing children movement, working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, testifying before Congress, sharing his family's story to push for better resources and protocols. He helped create infrastructure that's measurably saved lives, helped find children who otherwise might have remained missing, helped families navigate the nightmare he knew intimately. There's something both inspiring and heartbreaking about channeling grief into activism, using the worst thing that ever happened to you to try preventing it from happening to others. But I imagine there were moments when all that work felt hollow compared to just having Etan back. Moments when saving other children couldn't fill the hole left by losing his own son. The impact of Etan's case is quantifiable in lives saved, cases solved, and systems improved. For the Patz family, though, no amount of broader impact could ever truly compensate for what they lost on May 25, 1979. In September 2019, 40 years after Etan vanished and 2 years after Hernandez's conviction, news broke that stunned everyone who'd followed the case. Julie and Stanley Patz were leaving New York. They'd maintained that Soho loft for 4 decades, keeping it like a memorial, same phone number, same address, holding on to hope that somehow answers would come or Etan would find his way home. But now, with Hernandez behind bars and legal closure finally achieved, they were moving to Hawaii, literally putting an ocean between themselves and the place where their nightmare began. The New York Post ran the story with a headline that captured what everyone was thinking. Now the family has a chance to leave behind the ghosts of their past. Picture what it must have been like packing up that apartment after 40 years, finally dismantling Etan's room that had been frozen in time since 1979. Every toy, every piece of clothing, every childhood artifact representing not just memories, but hope that had sustained them through the darkest years imaginable. Leaving that space meant accepting in the most final way possible that Etan wasn't coming home, that the little boy who walked out their door would never walk back in, but it also meant releasing themselves from the self-imposed vigil they'd maintained. Acknowledging they'd done everything humanly possible and could finally allow themselves to just grieve without constant public scrutiny that came with being the Patz family. In New York, the decision to move to Hawaii was not random. It represented a complete geographic and psychological break from everything associated with their trauma. Hawaii meant sunshine, ocean views, a place where nobody would recognize them at the grocery store or ask about Etan at the post office. They could be just Julie and Stanley, not Etan Patz's parents, not the faces of missing children advocacy, not symbols of every parent's worst fear. After spending most of their adult lives in service to a cause they never wanted to be part of, they'd earned the right to simply exist without the weight of that identity. Moving did not mean forgetting Etan. You didn't forget your murdered child, but it meant choosing to live the years they had left without being defined solely by loss. The media coverage of their departure was respectful but melancholic, as if New York was losing something significant with their exit. International outlets picked up the story. Paris Match ran a feature about the family trying to turn the page 40 years after their son's death. There was something universally resonant about their decision, this idea that even after unimaginable tragedy, even after decades of suffering, you can still choose to pursue peace, if not happiness. Their story had become part of New York's cultural fabric, woven into conversations about crime, childhood, urban life, parenting. But they didn't owe the city their continued presence, didn't owe the world their pain as perpetual reminder of what can go wrong. What strikes me most about the Patz family's journey is the sheer endurance it required. 40 years of not knowing, then knowing but not having closure, then having legal closure but not physical remains, and finally choosing to move forward anyway. They demonstrated resilience that most of us will thankfully never need to access, the ability to survive something that destroys most families. Many marriages don't survive the loss of a child. Theirs did. Many people would have crumbled under constant media attention, endless questions, years of legal battles. They persevered. And now, in what should be their retirement years, they're starting over in Hawaii, trying to build a life that isn't defined by tragedy. Etan will always be part of their story. How could he not be? But he doesn't have to be the entire story anymore. After 40 years of being the family that lost Etan Patz, Julie and Stanley finally gave themselves permission to be something else, to exist in a space where their son's memory can live without consuming everything around it. The Etan Patz case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in and the vulnerabilities our children face every single day. For 38 years, Julie and Stanley Patz existed in a limbo that most of us can't even begin to comprehend, not knowing whether their son was alive or dead, or whether he suffered, whether someone out there held the answers they desperately needed. When Pedro Hernandez was finally convicted in 2017, it brought legal closure, but it couldn't undo 4 decades of anguish, couldn't bring back the little boy who just wanted to prove he was old enough to walk to school by himself, couldn't fill the hole left in their family and in American consciousness. What haunts me most about this case is how ordinary the threat was. Hernandez wasn't some obvious monster lurking in shadows. He was a teenage employee at a neighborhood store, someone who might have smiled at customers who seemed harmless enough that a 6-year-old boy would trust him when offered something as simple as a soda. That's the reality we need to face. Danger doesn't always announce itself with warning signs, doesn't always look threatening, and sometimes the person responsible is right there in the community, hiding behind normalcy while carrying unimaginable secrets for decades. The Patz family did everything they thought was right. They'd walked that route with Etan, taught him about safety, chose a morning when streets would be busy, and still, in those 2 blocks, everything went horribly, irreversibly wrong. So, I want to ask you something. How has learning about this case changed the way you think about child safety in your own life? Do you believe the systemic changes that came from Etan's disappearance, the Amber Alerts, the protocols, the heightened awareness, have genuinely made our children safer? Or have we gone too far in the other direction, raising kids who never experienced the independence and street smarts that come from navigating the world on their own? And what about Pedro Hernandez? Does his documented mental illness complicate your feelings about his conviction? Or do you believe justice was served regardless of his psychiatric issues? These aren't easy questions, and there are no perfect answers, but they're conversations we need to keep having as a society. If Etan's story has moved you, if you believe these cases deserve attention, and that missing children should never be forgotten, I'm asking you to subscribe to Missing Innocence and hit that notification bell. These aren't just stories we're covering. They're real children, real families, real tragedies that shaped how we protect the most vulnerable among us. Every case we examine here represents a life cut short, a family forever changed, and systemic failures we're still working to correct decades later. By staying informed, by keeping these stories alive in our collective memory, you're honoring these children and supporting the families who continue fighting for answers and justice. Let's make sure no child is forgotten, no case goes cold without people who care enough to keep asking the hard questions, to keep demanding accountability, to keep pushing for a world where children can walk 2 blocks to school without their parents living in fear. That's what Etan's legacy should be. Not just remembering what happened, but actively working to make sure it never happens again.